Okay, as soon as we get this to load, we'll start. Okay, today we're going to talk about students' rights, specifically the rights of students with a disability. So some of the topics we're going to go over are Section 504, IDEA, FAPE. We're going to talk about what OCR is and what they do. And then finally, we're going to go over a court case that went through the Supreme Court that shows how a school failed to provide a student with the necessary education. So first we have Section 504, which is part of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. As we see here on the screen, it is a federal civil rights law that prohibits discrimination based on disability in any program or activity operated by recipients of federal funds. We'll go over what some of those mean in just a second. I do want to point out, though, that 504 plan can include accommodations and modifications in the gen ed classroom, gen ed setting, or as some schools call them, or in a team room where you have a teacher and a TA. It does not include a special education program, things like a 1211 or a 611. Okay, so when we are talking about a recipient, we're referring to institutions, organizations, public or private, that receive types of federal funding. When we talk about federal funding, we're talking about grants or loans from the federal government, or monetary funds from the government. It can also include federal personnel that is put into the school or institution or organization. It can also include a recipient receiving property for a less than fair market value. Okay, so moving on, when we talk about a handicapped person or a person with disabilities, things like physical impairments and mental impairments are what we're referring to here. And it's something that limits them from one or more major life event. So when we talk physical impairment, we're talking physiological disorders and conditions. We're talking cosmetic disfigurement, as well as anatomical loss. When we talk mental impairment, it is things like mental retardation, emotional or mental illness, or specific learning disabilities. So you have things like students that are in a wheelchair, hard of hearing or deaf or visually impaired, things like ADHD, Down syndrome, autism spectrum disorder, and then even you have like social emotional learning issues, so social pragmatic disorder, or not that we see this often in young kids, but bipolar and schizophrenia, things like that. So when we are referring to a major life event, it is anything that is essentially what you do on a daily basis: walking, talking, eating, breathing, your ability to learn, your ability to work, your ability to perform a manual task, or just essentially caring for your oneself. Anything under that falls for a major life activity. So some of the things prohibited under Section 504, it prohibits these recipients from denying the benefit or of an aid or related service provider to the students with a disability. They cannot deny the person to participate in learning planning boards or advisory boards and such things. They cannot subject a person to discrimination based on their disability, and they must also choose an appropriate location that makes sure that people with disabilities can be included in the same way that a student without a disability can be. One last thing to mention specifically to 504 is it requires evaluations and placement procedures that ensure students are not mislabeled or misclassified or incorrectly placed within, say, their school. So if a student is in an inappropriate classroom, meaning they need more interventions or they need more support than a gen ed class can offer, and then they're placed in a gen ed, like that is not fair. They're not going to be able to learn in an appropriate way. Okay, moving on, we have IDEA. It stands for the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. As we see here, it's a federal law that makes available a free, appropriate public education to eligible children with disabilities throughout the nation, ensures special education and related services to those children. As we see here, it requires districts to have an IEP, individual education plan, in place for each of those students. We'll touch a little bit more on what an IEP is, but it is specific to each child. So there's not a generalized IEP for all children. Each one is different and created in different ways. So one of the things IDEA does is provides grants to help support education, special education, and related services. It helps with providing early intervention services and programs such as Kid Start. It helps with technology development. It helps with parent learning classes and information centers. It helps with institutions for higher education for people with disabilities. It also protects the rights of both the parents and the children. So they're there to help support the parents with things that they need to make sure that the students are getting what they deserve. So this, under IDEA, they ensure that teachers and parents are equipped with the tools that they need to provide the education that the best that they can for the students with disabilities, and to make sure that the methods of education are effective. So, history of IDEA, it was signed into law in November of 1975 by President Gerald Ford. When this happened, it opened the doors of public schools to millions of disabled students that prior to didn't have the same education opportunities as their non-disabled peers. It helped to make sure that they had equal opportunities as their peers, and it also does it in the sense of a least restrictive environment, which is something we'll go over a little bit later. Some fun facts that now more than 7.5 million children with disabilities have been provided with a special education and related services. In 1975, close to 1.8 million children were excluded before then. So currently, well, this is from 20 and 21, 66% of these disabled children spent a majority of their day in a gen ed classroom. So we're talking at least 80% of their day in a general education classroom. And 363,000 infants and toddlers were receiving early intervention. Okay, moving on, we have FAPE, Free Appropriate Public Education. You can see here it is available to all qualified persons with a disability within the jurisdiction of a school district. Okay, so an appropriate education consists of regular classes with or without the assistance of related services or aids for a student, or special education. It can include special education classes with related services and aids. And it can be designed for in the school setting, at home, or it doesn't matter if it's a private or a public institute. So when we're referring to an aid, that is things such as interpreters for people who are deaf or hard of hearing and need help with that. Children with a reading disability that need someone to read for them, as well as door-to-door transporters who help, say, students in a wheelchair get off the bus and into the building safely. When we look at related services, it is your physical therapist who helps students with their gross motor skills, or occupational therapists who help with fine motor, things like writing, cutting, as well as speech therapists. You have psychological counseling and necessary medical diagnostic services. So some of the things that an appropriate education will include are the services that we've just discussed, to help the students have just as much opportunity and to ensure that they do just as well as their peers without a disability. We have the IEP. The quality of their education and their experiences needs to be the same as the peers that are non-disabled. Teachers must be properly trained to work with disabled students in special education. I know a lot of schools require teachers to actually have that special education cert to teach them. A facility must be comparable. So something we'll talk about a little later is every now and then there's a student that is not learning to the best of their ability within their public schools, so they will be sent to a more specialized school, and that school needs to offer the same types of opportunities as the home public school does. Inclusion to the maximum appropriate extent for academics as well as non-academics. So things such as physical education, sports and organizations that are sponsored by the school, health services, they need to have the same type of transportation opportunities, referrals to agencies, as well as help with employment when it comes time for that. We have, it needs to include procedures to prevent the misclassification and inappropriate placement. One of the ways by doing that is, like we mentioned, periodic reevaluations. Those kind of involve a due process procedures and hearings, and these will include parents, guardians, caregivers. It's important to know that parents and guardians are always given the opportunity to join these meetings. It's at no cost to the parents. The school district covers the expenses for this. They must receive fair notice, so the parents must know ahead of time that this meeting is coming up so that they have the opportunity to join and voice their opinions on the student's education, go over records. Parents are actually allowed to challenge. So if they don't agree with the IEP, or agree with the placement, agree with the education that their child is learning, they can challenge that. So some of the procedures for these evaluations under IDEA, they are done every 3 years. Some of the ways that they wouldn't be is if the student has become successful on their own, then they would be dismissed with the caregiver's consent. They would be dismissed from needing to have an IEP. In some cases, the meetings would be more frequently if a student has more needs than what's anticipated. So a recipient must use many different sources in these evaluations and placement processes. So significant factors are to be considered. Those are things like aptitude and achievements, tests, teacher recommendations, their physical condition, social and cultural backgrounds, because what you would consider typical for one type of cultural background is not for another. So those are things that would have to be considered as if what they are doing is typical for them. And different types of adaptive behavior, social responsibility, and personal independence that are age and culture appropriate again. Um, these assessments should be done by trained professionals or trained personnel. Um, they're validated for the specific purpose that they are used and created to assess specific areas. So, like your physical therapist would test for physical growth, and same for occupational. These, when you have an IEP, these related services will set goals for the student. So when they assess them, they are assessing at how frequently they are reaching their goals and how successfully they are reaching their goals. This also happens in the special education, typically like 12-on-1 program or such. With a special education teacher, they set goals at these meetings and they track the data to make sure, and they assess and they test to make sure that they're reaching their appropriate goals based on what's set in the beginning. So these meetings are designed to best ensure that the results are accurate for the student, and it needs to be based on sensory, speaking, and manual skills. So it does not reflect on their impaired skills. So, for example, if you have a student in a wheelchair, you're not going to assess him on how well he can walk down a straight line. Or if you have a hearing impaired student, you're not going to assess them on their hearing skills. Moving on, we kind of talked a little bit. If a school must place a student in an outside facility, it needs to be equivalent to them. It needs to be considered proximity to home so that travel is not happening too far. It is the responsibility of the home school district to provide that transportation, as well as if it's a private institute and there's costs involved with sending the student there, that falls on the school district and not the parents. A lot of times this will happen because the school cannot provide a student with the free appropriate public education that they deserve, so they send them out. But a lot of times that's because of misclassification and not appropriate placement. So they're working to prevent that from happening right from the beginning. So it's also illegal to base these decisions on a stereotype. So just because a student is deaf does not mean you will automatically send them to a deaf school. You do have to do your best to provide them with the things by using those related services and those interpreters. Okay, so when we talk about free education, the recipients cannot charge families for having these students here. So if it's free for your typical student, it needs to be free for your disabled or handicapped student. If a parent on their own chooses to have their child sent to a specialized institution, I know locally we have some autism schools. So if a parent with an autistic child chose to send them there just because they want to, then it is the parent's responsibility to pay for their education. It would not fall back on the home school district at that point. Also, if there isn't a local specialized school and the home school district chooses to send a child out of district, and room and board are an issue, then the school would have to cover that. They have to cover the travel expenses, room and board, all things under that. Okay. Next up, we have OCR, the Office for Civil Rights. As we see here, it is the responsibility to investigate claims and complaints of discrimination. It has the authority to enforce Section 504. If they will try to voluntarily bring a school district into a negotiation for a corrective agreement. Um, that does typically happen, but if it does not, they do initiate enforcement actions on the schools. There's multiple steps to this. They will offer assistance in training and doing what they can to help the district better themselves in this. And that's kind of a mild case. Long run, there has been times where they've gone in and removed administrative personnel and replaced them with people they see more fit to try to bring the school to what it should be. Okay, lastly, we have Andrew F. versus Douglas County School District. So just to read from here, Andrew was a child with autism who attended a public school from kindergarten through fourth grade. In April of 2010, Andrew's parents rejected the fifth grade Individualized Education Program, IEP, proposed by the Douglas County School District. So Andrew's parents, when they went to his annual IEP meeting, felt that the IEP being presented was the same as it had been in years past. They also had felt that at this point his growth in the school had stopped. It had stalled. He was not progressing in a way that the parents felt that he should, which does happen from time to time. IEPs are supposed to change, as I mentioned. Different goals are set by different teachers and service providers, and these children should be reaching these goals that are appropriate, not extenuous, hard to reach goals. They are small step goals for students. So they felt that year after year, this was the same IEP. He wasn't growing. The IEP should be changed. So they challenged it and ended up withdrawing him from the public school and placed him in a private school for autism, where he did extremely well. He didn't have the behaviors. His education was growing. He was learning much more. His social interactions had been doing well. So with this, the parents felt that the school district did not provide him with FAPE that he was entitled to. So they went through the judicial hearing, and at that hearing, they were told, nope, the school district has provided him with everything that he needs to be successful. So, let's backtrack. So when they put him in the private school, there was a tuition involved, and the parents wanted the school district to provide the tuition. They said that the school district had not provided him with the appropriate education. And then that's when it went to the judicial hearing. There, they said, nope, the school district did everything. They turned down the parents' wishes for the school to pay the tuition. It then moved on to I think it was the 10th Circuit, and there it was once again their challenge was denied. It was shut down. They again said, nope, the school district is not liable. They did everything they needed to. They do not have to pay. This was your choice. So after that, his parents took their case to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court overlooked it all. They agreed that the IEP had not been changed and agreed that the school was not willing to provide him with a free, appropriate public education. And as a result, they did rule in the favor of the parents.